A black man in regular clothes walks into a police station and asks to speak with someone in charge. To the officers, he looked homeless. To Internal Affairs, he was their new boss on his first undercover inspection. Commander David Washington adjusted the collar of his worn flannel shirt as he approached the entrance of the 15th Precinct on a humid Tuesday morning in Detroit. At 42, he had spent 18 years climbing the ranks of law enforcement, earning respect through dedication, integrity, and an unwavering commitment to justice. Today marked his first day as the new head of internal affairs for the district, but none of the officers inside knew that yet. The building stood like a concrete fortress on Corktown's main street, its windows reflecting the morning sun. Washington had deliberately chosen his outfit: faded jeans, an old flannel shirt, and scuffed work boots. His appearance was carefully calculated to test something he'd suspected for months: that this precinct had serious problems with how officers treated civilians, particularly black civilians. Washington pushed through the heavy glass doors into the lobby. The interior was typical of urban police stations: fluorescent lighting, worn linoleum floors, and the persistent smell of coffee and disinfectant. Behind a thick glass partition sat the duty desk, where Sergeant Mike Morrison was reviewing paperwork with the casual indifference of someone who'd been doing the same job for too many years. Morrison looked up as Washington approached, his expression immediately shifting from boredom to mild annoyance. He saw a black man in working-class clothes, unshaven, walking with the measured pace of someone who might be looking for trouble or handouts. "Help you?" Morrison asked curtly, not bothering to look up from his paperwork. Washington stopped at the window, placing his hands casually in his pockets. "Good morning, officer. I'd like to speak with someone in charge, please." Morrison's pen stopped moving. He looked up with the expression of someone who'd heard this request 1,000 times from people he considered beneath his attention. "Someone in charge," Morrison repeated, his voice dripping with skepticism. "About what exactly?" "I have some business to discuss with your commanding officer," Washington replied calmly, maintaining steady eye contact. Morrison leaned back in his chair, making a show of looking Washington up and down. "Business? What kind of business would you have with a police commander?" Behind Morrison, Officer Janet Collins looked up from her computer terminal. At 28, she was relatively new to the force, but had quickly adopted the attitudes of her more experienced colleagues. She nudged Officer Rick Torres, pointing subtly toward the lobby. "Looks like we got another one," Collins whispered to Torres, loud enough for Washington to hear. Torres, a veteran officer with 15 years on the force, walked over to Morrison's desk. "Problem here, Sarge." Morrison gestured toward Washington with his pen. "Gentleman here says he has business with the commander, wants to speak with someone in charge." Torres looked through the glass at Washington, his expression hardening. "Sir, this is a police station, not a social services office. If you need help with housing or food assistance, there's a community center 6 blocks down the street." Washington remained perfectly calm, though internally he was taking notes on every word, every gesture, every assumption being made. "I appreciate the suggestion, officer, but I specifically need to speak with your commanding officer about police business." The three officers exchanged glances. Morrison stood up, walking closer to the glass partition. "Police business?" Morrison asked, his voice taking on a mocking tone. "Are you filing a complaint? Because if you are, you need to fill out forms first. Lots of forms. It's a very complicated process." Collins snickered from her desk. "Might want to make sure you can actually read and write before you start filing complaints." Washington's jaw tightened slightly, but his voice remained even. "I don't need to file a complaint. I need to speak directly with your commanding officer. This is official business." Torres stepped closer to the partition. "Official business? Sir, I think you might be confused about where you are." This isn't the kind of place where you can just walk in off the street and demand to see the boss. Actually, Washington replied quietly, it's exactly that kind of place. Police stations are public buildings, funded by taxpayer money, and citizens have the right to request meetings with commanding officers. Morrison's face reddened slightly. He didn't like being corrected, especially by someone he'd already categorized as beneath his concern. Listen, pal, Morrison said, his voice hardening. I don't know what you think this is, but you can't just wander in here looking like you just rolled out of a homeless camp and expect us to roll out the red carpet. Collins laughed outright at Morrison's comment. Maybe he thinks this is a hotel, she added. Washington stood perfectly still, his expression unchanged. Are you refusing to allow me to speak with your commanding officer? Torres crossed his arms over his chest. We're trying to help you understand the proper procedures. You want to speak with someone in charge. You make an appointment. You fill out paperwork. You follow protocol. And you definitely need to clean yourself up before any commanding officer would agree to see you, Morrison added, waving his hand dismissively. Washington reached into his back pocket, causing all three officers to tense slightly. He pulled out a simple leather wallet, opening it to reveal his identification. Perhaps this will help clarify the situation, Washington said, sliding his ID through the small opening in the glass partition. Morrison picked up the identification card, glancing at it casually. His expression changed instantly. The color drained from his face as he read the words Internal Affairs and Commander David Washington. What is this? Morrison whispered, staring at the ID as if it might disappear. Collins noticed Morrison's expression and walked over. What's wrong, Mike? Torres moved closer as well, looking over Morrison's shoulder at the identification. When he saw what it said, he took an involuntary step backward. This has got to be fake, Collins said, but her voice lacked conviction. Washington reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out his official badge, setting it on the counter next to his identification. The gold shield gleamed under the fluorescent lights, impossible to ignore or deny. Commander David Washington, Internal Affairs Division, he said quietly. I believe I requested to speak with someone in charge. The lobby fell completely silent. Morrison stared at the badge and identification as if they were radioactive. Torres looked like he might be sick. Collins seemed frozen in place, her mind racing to recall every word she'd said in the past 10 minutes. Commander, Morrison stammered, we didn't know. We weren't told. You weren't told what, Sergeant? Washington asked, his voice still calm but carrying new authority. You weren't told to treat citizens with respect. You weren't told that police stations are public buildings where taxpayers have rights. Morrison's hands were shaking as he passed the identification back through the window. Sir, I apologize. We made a mistake. A mistake? Washington repeated. Sergeant Morrison, in the past 10 minutes, you've made assumptions about my character based on my appearance, refused to provide basic citizen services, made derogatory comments about my intelligence and housing status, and generally behaved in a manner completely unbecoming of a police officer. Collins stepped forward, her face pale. Commander, we can explain. Officer Collins, Washington interrupted. I'd very much like to hear your explanation for why you found it appropriate to question a citizen's literacy and suggest they looked homeless. Torres cleared his throat nervously. Sir, we deal with a lot of difficult people in this lobby. Sometimes we have to be cautious about... Cautious about what, Officer Torres? Washington asked. Cautious about treating black citizens with dignity. Cautious about following basic protocols, or cautious about assuming that someone's worth is determined by their clothing. The three officers stood in uncomfortable silence. Through the lobby's windows, other precinct personnel could be seen going about their daily routines, unaware that their colleague were being evaluated by the new Internal Affairs commander. Washington picked up his badge and identification, tucking them back into his pocket. I think we need to have a conversation with your commanding officer. All of us. Morrison reached for his phone with trembling hands. I'll call Captain Martinez right away. That won't be necessary, Washington replied. I'll be speaking with Captain Martinez personally. In the meantime, I want all three of you to write detailed reports about this interaction. Include everything you said, everything you assumed, and everything you would do differently if given the chance. Collins looked confused. Reports about what, exactly? Washington smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Reports about how you treated a citizen who walked into your police station asking for basic service. Reports about the assumptions you made and the comments you felt appropriate to make. Reports that will become part of your permanent personnel files. Torres stepped forward. Commander, surely we can handle this internally without... Officer Torres, Washington said, his voice sharp for the first time. This is being handled internally, by Internal Affairs, by me. The weight of the situation was finally sinking in for all three officers. Morrison sank back into his chair, his face ashen. Collins stared at the floor, apparently reviewing every word she'd spoken. Torres looked like he wanted to disappear entirely. Washington looked at each of them in turn. I want those reports on my desk by end of shift today, and I want you to think very carefully about something. If I was a regular citizen instead of your new Internal Affairs commander, how would this interaction have affected my view of this police department? How would it have affected my trust in law enforcement? Sir, Morrison said quietly, we really didn't mean any disrespect. Sergeant Morrison, Washington replied, disrespect is exactly what you showed. You disrespected me as a citizen, you disrespected the badge you wear, and you disrespected the community you're sworn to serve. At that moment, Captain Rosa Martinez appeared in the lobby, having been alerted by the desk officer about unusual activity at the front desk. She was a veteran officer with 22 years of experience and a reputation for running a tight ship. What's going on out here? Martinez asked, looking between her officers and Washington. Washington turned to face her, extending his hand. Captain Martinez, I'm Commander David Washington, Internal Affairs. I believe we have an appointment this morning. Martinez's eyes widened slightly as she shook his hand. Commander Washington, I was expecting you, but not... I thought you'd come through the back entrance. I wanted to see how your front desk operations handled a routine citizen request, Washington explained. It's been very educational. Martinez looked at her three officers, noting their obvious distress. I see. Commander, would you like to discuss this in my office? In a moment, Washington replied. He turned back to Morrison, Collins, and Torres. Gentlemen, Officer Collins, remember what I said about those reports. I'll be reviewing them carefully. As Washington and Martinez walked toward the administrative offices, Morrison slumped in his chair, Torres stared at the ceiling, and Collins sat down heavily at her desk. We're screwed, Collins whispered. Completely screwed, Torres agreed. Morrison just shook his head. 18 years on this job, and I've never made a mistake this bad. In Captain Martinez's office, Washington settled into a chair across from her desk. The office was professional but warm, with commendations and community service awards lining the walls. Commander, Martinez began, I have to ask, was this some kind of test? Washington nodded. An unscheduled evaluation. I've received reports about citizen complaints regarding treatment in this precinct's lobby. I wanted to see for myself how your officers handle walk-in requests from civilians. Martinez winced. And what did you observe? Captain, in less than 10 minutes, your officers made every mistake it's possible to make when dealing with the public. They profiled me based on my appearance, refused basic services, made derogatory assumptions about my intelligence and housing status, and showed complete contempt for citizen rights. Martinez closed her eyes briefly. Commander, I can explain. Captain Martinez, Washington interrupted gently. I'm not here to end careers or destroy your precinct. I'm here to identify problems and fix them. But what I witnessed this morning represents a serious breakdown in professional standards. Martinez leaned forward. What do you recommend? Washington pulled out a small notebook, flipping through several pages. Mandatory sensitivity training for all lobby personnel, revised protocols for citizen interactions, regular unscheduled evaluations, and a complete review of complaint procedures. And my officers, Martinez asked. That depends on their reports and their willingness to acknowledge what went wrong, Washington replied. This can be a learning experience or a career-ending event. That choice is largely up to them. Martinez nodded slowly. Commander, I want you to know that this behavior doesn't represent the values I try to instill in my officers. I believe that, Captain. But good intentions aren't enough. Systems need to be in place to ensure that every citizen who walks through that door is treated with dignity and respect, regardless of how they look or dress. Over the next several hours, Washington conducted interviews with Morrison, Collins, and Torres. Each officer submitted detailed reports about the lobby incident, and each expressed genuine remorse for their behavior. Morrison's report was particularly thorough. I made assumptions about Commander Washington based solely on his appearance and clothing. I failed to provide the basic citizen services that are fundamental to police work. I showed disrespect for a member of the public and violated the trust placed in me as a police officer. Collins wrote, I made inappropriate comments about a citizen's intelligence and housing status. I participated in behavior that was unprofessional and discriminatory. I failed to uphold the standards expected of a police officer. Torres added, I refused a reasonable citizen request and made assumptions based on racial and socioeconomic stereotypes. My behavior was unacceptable and contradicted everything I swore to uphold when I took this job. Washington reviewed each report carefully. While the behavior had been unacceptable, the officers' willingness to acknowledge their mistakes and commit to change suggested that this could indeed be a learning experience rather than a career-ending event. 2 weeks later, the 15th Precinct implemented new citizen service protocols. All lobby personnel completed mandatory sensitivity training. Complaint procedures were simplified and made more accessible. Random evaluations became standard practice. Washington made regular visits to the precinct lobby, sometimes in uniform, sometimes in civilian clothes. The change in atmosphere was remarkable. Officers were more professional, more respectful, and more focused on serving the community. Morrison, Collins, and Torres each received formal reprimands in their personnel files, but they also became advocates for the changes Washington implemented. Morrison later said, Meeting Commander Washington taught me that the badge doesn't make you better than anyone else. It makes you responsible to everyone else. 6 months after the incident, citizen complaints at the 15th Precinct had dropped by 60%. Community trust in the department began to improve. And Washington continued his work, knowing that real change happened one interaction at a time, one officer at a time, one moment of accountability at a time. Because sometimes the most powerful lessons come not from lectures or training manuals, but from the simple realization that the person standing in front of you might be exactly the person you least expect them to be. And sometimes the most important question isn't, who are you? But, how are you treating the person in front of you?